The X-Men movies are some of the best superhero movies ever made, and they gave us one of the most iconic performances of all time with Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So today, in honor of Deadpool and Wolverine and the Fox universe dying, we're gonna rank them. Go ahead and like this video, and let's get started. Okay, so right off the bat, we're going in release order, and this is the first X-Men movie, one of the first superhero movies ever made. Of course, we're talking about X-Men, and of course, X-Men's gotta go S. And hear me out. Without this movie, we don't have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. That's a huge one. I think the entire cast is pretty fantastic. Halle Berry does have a pretty weak script in this, but at the same time, I just think black leather costumes aside, this is a really well made movie. And at the time, just an incredible superhero movie with awesome action scenes. And honestly, I wish they still felt like this because this to me is like, you know, prime time superhero content. Followed up by X2, which is again an S, and better than the first one somehow. The addition of Pyro is amazing. You get an opening sequence with Nightcrawler, which is one of the most iconic superhero sequences maybe of all time. Maybe the best opening scene in any superhero movie ever. And again, just ups the stakes in every way and just starts this movie off with the two amazing films riding right alongside Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 as like these two great sequels that came out right around the same time to the superhero genre. And then you have The Last Stand, which was a disaster. Right off the bat, I'm going to go C with The Last Stand. It still has its moments that are entertaining. Of course, you have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, so what are you really going to complain about? He's great. Everyone's great in their parts, but the script really lacks here. It's way too short. It feels totally thrown together. It feels like the ideas were there, but the Dark Phoenix storyline is really betrayed in this movie, even if I am a fan of that scene. And another thing that isn't talked about in this movie is the scene where Magneto and Professor X go to Jean Grey's house as a kid. That de-aging is some of the best de-aging I've seen to this day. Maybe I'm crazy for that, but for the time, the de-aging of that scene is like nuts. It usually looks terrible, so that is a really impressive scene still. Speaking of great CGI, X-Men Origins Wolverine's gonna be a D. Yeah, it was a guilty pleasure when I was a kid, but rewatching it, I tried really hard to rewatch it, and I got basically to the scene on the farm where he cuts the guy's sink, and his CGI claws are just egregious looking, and I decided to turn it off. I couldn't get through it. Yeah, as a kid, I enjoyed this. The Blob is cool. The Gambit, the only time we get Gambit in these movies, Wink, is cool, but it just... And then you get X-Men First Class, which I would go A. And the reason I'm going A and not S is because Kevin Bacon's villain in this film is pretty forgettable. I think his intro with Magneto at the concentration camp is very, very well done. And from that point forward, he just goes downhill as a villain. The final sequence for me and the final third of the movie is really tough. And Zoe Kravitz is not really doing it for me in this movie either. But at the same time, Michael Fassbender's Magneto is the second best thing we've gotten in any X-Men movie at this point. Because I would argue he's as good as his character as Hugh Jackman is as Wolverine. And I don't know if we've gotten that caliber, that kind of actor in one of these movies, at least the X-Men movies, up until this point in superhero history. Like, Fassbender at the time wasn't a big name, but as a talent, I mean, goddamn, I can't believe he even did it. You don't see that guy doing a lot of, well, I guess he did Assassin's Creed. But yeah, I mean, it's just a great movie. It's really cool. It's got great sequences. Obviously, the bar scene with the knife with Magneto is like one of the coolest things in any of these movies. And then we've got the Wolverine, which is kind of a mixed bag. I think I'll go B. I think I'll go B with Wolverine because it's got great action sequences. And in general, Hugh Jackman, again, carrying the movie on his back. But man, oh man, does it go downhill in the last act. Everything with, I think her name was Viper and the robotic samurai. It just like, what was his name? Silver Samurai was the villain, I believe. Man, it's a bummer because it had so many pieces to be fantastic. And you can tell because Logan was so damn good. Days of Future Past. Days of Future Past is going to be an S. It's definitely my favorite X-Men movie that is not in the first two. As far as contemporary, definitely my favorite. One of my favorite superhero movies of all time. This movie does everything for me. I think the plot is fantastic. I think the way they weaved the two worlds together after the success of First Class was a huge risk. It was very confusing because it was like, why even make First Class if you're going to go back? But it totally worked. And it beyond totally worked. It's a translation of the comic book in such a great way. And for what it means to be a comic book movie, I feel like this one is just really out there for the X-Men franchise. And the first time we're stepping into full-on comic book adaptation of an iconic storyline. And then we've got Deadpool, which I think is a B. It's good, and I enjoyed it a lot the first time. I would say I loved it. I will say I read Deadpool comic books as a kid. It was my favorite comic book series, probably from the age of 14 on. So I was really excited for this movie, and at the time I loved it. But I think on rewatch I just outgrew it, or maybe the jokes don't land as much when you know what's coming. But I think it's a fair to say it's a B. And then Apocalypse is such a bummer because Apocalypse is it has some awesome scenes, like the scene in the woods with Magneto, his family getting killed, and him murdering all the soldiers with a bow and arrow. That's the coolest thing ever. But you get a misused Oscar Isaac. You get Jennifer Lawrence not wanting to be there. You get a bunch of weird new cast members that are completely just like not there for any reason, completely unnecessary. Really bad move to bring in all of those new characters. Honestly, I am surprised they didn't learn more from Days of Future Past, and instead of leaning on like a new Nightcrawler, you figure out how to bring him in from the old franchise. But yeah, that movie just did not capitalize on a good idea, and it could have been great. And I remember being very excited for it. And then Logan is an A. Logan's fantastic. Logan has, again, two of the most solid acts in any superhero movies ever, followed by a third act that I personally do not love. I know that's a controversial opinion. I just don't think the kids towards the end of the film worked for me personally. And then you got Deadpool 2, which I think is better than the first one, and I will go A. I don't think it's as strong as maybe another movie on this list, but it is a very entertaining one. It's David Leitch before I think David Leitch started doing things that feel exactly the same as this movie, but without the interesting characters. It's almost like he makes Deadpool every movie, but without Deadpool. He makes these non-serious action movies that feel so fluff and so nothing. But if Deadpool's in it, it makes sense. But his movies just don't work for me outside of the John Wick movies, of course, that he worked on. He doesn't work on them anymore. So yeah, I think A for Deadpool 2. And obviously Josh Brolin as Cable is fantastic. Really interesting that Josh Brolin played Thanos and Cable. No, you don't really think about that often, and it's two different parts, but still interesting he played both. Dark Phoenix, gotta go D. I haven't even finished this movie. I've tried plenty of times. I bet there's some scenes or something in here that I would think was cool, but I can't even get through it. And unfortunately, the same story is with New Mutants. Maybe I could try to get through it someday. I've gotten about halfway through both these movies. I remember hating Anya Taylor-Joy after seeing New Mutants, and I'm actually really bummed for her because she had this happen in a big franchise, huge franchise, big promises. And then she has the bomb of Furiosa, which is another bummer, right? Because Furiosa, obviously she's getting praise in her performance. It made a fraction of what it was hoping to make and performed pretty lackluster. And then we got Deadpool and Wolverine, which I know on my Marvel list, I said it was an A, but I think in the context of X-Men, it is an S. I had so much fun with this movie. And it's so interesting. How often do you see a trilogy of movies getting better with every one? I think this movie gets better with every one. I think they one up the Deadpool vibe every time. I think as a Deadpool fan, this movie delivered. The Deadpool core is not something I would have ever thought I would have seen for some reason, because it makes perfect sense, but it's just, I honestly think they couldn't have pulled it off without the budget that they had for this movie, because you can just tell how much bigger this movie is. But the other thing I want to really lean into on this movie is that the sets are so well built. And Marvel movies, you're worried always about blue screen, but this movie feels significantly smaller. It doesn't take away from it feeling like a blockbuster film, but the sets are really tangible. They're actually, there's backgrounds behind them in these sequences. You can see they've built most of these sets. And I don't think that's getting enough attention because it seems like Ryan Reynolds addressed that criticism very clearly in what they did. And I think it totally paid off. So I think it is one of the best superhero movies and one of the best X-Men movies. I would probably say it's in my top 15 superhero movies of all time, and definitely my top 4 X-Men movies. So that's basically it, guys. Please can subscribe and Filmsdoc.